There are about 1,000 different ways that humans have invented to kill each other. But despite all these ways to kill, for millennia people have tried to cheat death or at least delay it. The science of extending lifespan is still in its relative infancy, but there are things that you can do today to improve your odds of living longer. But let's get back to those brains. Wade says that early mummies like those of King Tut show little evidence of brain removal. A 2017 study he worked on found that many royal mummies had fully intact endo and exoskeletal systems. This was because during the earliest stages of mummification, it was reserved only for kings and queens, and they were thought to be immortal. Even after death, it wasn't until around 2680 to 2050 BC, when the practice was adopted by the wider population. Mummies began to reveal signs of brain removal around 2000 BC. What's going on here? Wade asked himself and his colleagues, were the Egyptians changing their beliefs about the afterlife? Were they changing their procedures to better preserve the body for the journey into the afterlife? Or were they simply trying to stop bodies from rotting before burial? With help from the Royal Ontario Museum, they managed to get high-resolution computed tomography or CT scans of 6 mummies that previously had no recorded brain or organ removals. 5 of the 6 showed evidence of some sort of brain removal, so maybe it had something to do with preventing decomposition. What's more, Wade's team noticed that this form of mushy brain removal became more common among lower socioeconomic classes as time went on, which meant it couldn't be linked to any religious beliefs. Instead, they concluded that it was likely done to prevent animals from getting at the body. Perhaps cats, who were revered in ancient Egypt as divine creatures, were digging up human brains. At least now we know not to trust them. Wade said in a statement, "These results are surprising because if the removal of the brain and viscera was part of the standard mummification procedure, then we should expect to see differences between upper and lower socioeconomic status groups in terms of timing, technique, and completeness of organ removal." They also wanted to find out what tools the Egyptians used to extract squishy bits. Wade teamed up with a medical illustrator and created 3-dimensional renderings of the mummy's skulls. Their findings revealed that ancient Egyptians started off by poking a hole into the skull through the frontal lobe. This seems counterintuitive given that the cranium is quite a hard surface. But Wade explains that they probably poked the hole while the brain was still soft, most likely at the start of the process when the body hadn't yet begun to decompose. The openings enlarged over time as the remains were repeatedly flushed. While some researchers have suggested that embalmers may have used a hook to scoop out the brain matter, Wade believes that a combination of flushing and blunt force trauma was responsible. Ultimately, these holes would have helped draw out the brain tissue and empty the cranial cavity. Not only does this explanation make sense given the repeated use of the opening, but it's also consistent with the tools that we find in archaeological contexts. Said Wade, "We find lots of materials that could have been used for hooking and scooping, but the vast majority of these are simple probes and blunt instruments." Wade acknowledges that it's difficult to understand why anyone would want to flesh out someone's brain, but explained in the statement that there are several reasons for the removal of the brain. These include preservation of the body, prevention of postmortem decomposition, and transformation of the body into a vessel for the soul. So yeah, I guess I don't need to worry too much about anyone flushing out my brain after I die. I am pretty worried about what happens to my YouTube channel though. This is why. But regardless of whether your brain gets flushed out or not, knowing how the mummification process worked can help us learn more about what life was like in ancient Egypt. It might even teach us a thing or two about dealing with the dead. Who knows? You might even learn how to live longer in the process. If you want to know how to live longer, let's move on to the rest of the body. Wade also worked on a study looking at evisceration practices that was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. The study's authors analyzed several mummies, ranging from around 2500 BC to 1900 BC. They discovered that there were two main ways that the organs were removed. Early mummies were mostly men, priests, and officials, and their intestines were removed through an incision made in the left side of the abdomen. Later mummies, mainly from poorer backgrounds, mostly women and children, had their intestines removed through the anus. The researchers suggest that removing the insides this way was easier and quicker. However, Wade explains that the latter method may actually have been done so that the anus could be sewn up. This would keep the body more intact and the coffin lighter, thus requiring less linen wrappings. Also, it may have been a way for the embalmer to reuse the intestines. Some of the later mummies in the study had their intestines placed back into the abdominal cavity. This would have been done to make the mummy look more realistic and recognizable to friends and family members. The intestines were also sometimes removed for cleaning purposes, or if the individual died of a particularly nasty infection, to stop the spread of disease. To find out how these incisions were made, Wade and his team looked at serial sections of two mummies. They determined that the Egyptians didn't use sharp tools on the living. The incisions were instead made after the person died, likely when the body was more rigid and easier to cut. They also noted that the tools used for evisceration were different from those used for brain removal. For example, blunt probes were used to separate the intestines from the abdominal wall, while long hooks were used to retrieve the organs through the anus. Now that we have a better understanding of what happened to the mummies' brains and guts, researchers can focus on other mysteries, such as what happened to their hearts and how long the entire mummification process took. Whatever they find will hopefully shed more light on a truly unique window into the past. The science of extending lifespan is still in its relative infancy, but there are things that you can do today to improve your odds of living longer. So until next time, this is the host. And remember, don't poke holes in your brain. Well, not unless you're an archaeologist studying mummies. Then it's cool.